We were, spending all this money on helping people survive on the streets instead of focusing on getting people off and out of the streets.
Unsheltered homelessness is the most visible, the most inhumane, and the only part of that problem that is actually solvable. The biggest thing holding us back is that people just believe it's not possible.
I'm Julie Rose, and this is Top of Mind. I have been a radio journalist for 2 decades, but a few years ago, I found myself avoiding the news for long stretches because of how depressing and divisive it all seems. I still wanted to be informed and engaged on important issues, though, and I figured I couldn't be alone in that. So we created this podcast. Each week, we tackle one tough topic in a way that will challenge you, help you feel more empathy, and empower you to become a better citizen, a kinder neighbor, and a more effective advocate. Today, is it possible to solve homelessness?
It's extremely hard getting out of homelessness. Because when you think about all the little steps it's going to take, it becomes so overwhelming and so burdened. It's scary.
This is Kwika Montoya in Denver.
I had a career I was building in commercial real estate. I had a family. We owned a home. I would say on the outside, I looked pretty successful and well put together. But when my family broke up, my world came crashing down. I lost my job. My house went into foreclosure. And then at the end of 2011 is when I started experiencing street homelessness. And I experienced it for 3 years. I was in a mode where it's just like there's no hope for me now. I mean, when you think about just like that pathway, there's no just get a job. Just the thought of okay, where am I going to take a shower? Where are my interview clothes? There was the anxiety of gaining a criminal background. What was that going to do for my career? When you think about where we're at with the cost of housing right now in Denver, how am I ever going to find another, sign a lease if I can't find a decent enough job to pay for that housing? How can you even begin to think about all the steps it's going to take to create a stable life while you're in this horrible constant state of crisis?
There are more people homeless in America today than at any time since the federal government started reporting that data 17 years ago. And it would be a lot worse had states not received millions for emergency housing during the pandemic. That money's all dried up now. And anywhere you turn in a major city, the problem seems to be more in your face. Back in the early 2000s, many of those same cities made a big splash adopting, quote, 10-year plans to end homelessness. And they got a big push from the White House to do it. And yet here we are. Homelessness in America feels intractable. But is it? That's today on Top of Mind. Denver was one of the first big cities to adopt a 10-year plan to end homelessness and to start making real progress on it. This was in 2005. And right away, the city managed to reduce its chronically homeless population by 2/3. Momentum was steady, and other cities were looking to copy Denver's success. And then came the Great Recession, followed by the foreclosure crisis. Homelessness started increasing again in Denver. This was around the time Kwika Montoya landed on the street.
It's a slow disconnection from the larger community. You start getting looks like you're a worthless individual. People start to ignore you.
Montoya, like a lot of people in her situation, avoided homeless shelters.
It's unfortunate. I think shelters are a great option for some people, but I heard scary rumors about women's shelters, at least the one women's shelter that was around when I was experiencing homelessness. So I listened to what the streets were telling me, and they were telling me that was not always the safest place to go.
So instead, she roamed with a small group of people who were also experiencing homelessness. They avoided downtown Denver, though, because the mayor had banned street camping in response to the homelessness spike in 2011, and police were actively sweeping camps.
So we would bounce in and out of hotels. I mean, we did sleep in tents every now and then, but that wasn't a common experience. So our goal was to try to make enough money to be in hotels. And then there would be the off chance that we'd have to sleep outside.
Homelessness itself is traumatic, says Montoya. On top of that, though, she was struggling with mental health problems.
I did not have very many coping strategies to help. I used alcohol, which led to cocaine, which led to heroin, meth, all the majors at different points in my journey. And I also had different points in my journey where, I would try really hard, and then I would fall back down, and then I would try really hard, and I would fall back down.
What turned around for you?
I call it I woke up. I was, in my mid-30s. I was in jail. I think it was between 90 days and 6 months. It just, felt like the upside down, right? It was I didn't know who I was when I looked in the mirror anymore. And it was just kind of like an existential crisis. It was I got to get out of here, and I got to do whatever I need to do to fix whatever's going on with me. Not that anything was wrong with me, but that I was clearly struggling, and I wanted to heal whatever part of me was struggling.
Montoya's mom let her move back in for 2 weeks after she got out of jail.
We were at the point where she had allowed me to live with her a couple of different times, and I'd burned that bridge. So this was a very guided time with her, and that 2 weeks was desperately trying to find a place for me to go.
They found a group home for people transitioning out of homelessness, and that's where Montoya got sober and also put her name on the wait list for a housing voucher. Denver was one of the first cities to embrace a housing-first approach, which meant Montoya didn't need to get sober first or even get a job. Those things came after she was housed. After a year in that group home, her name came up for a spot in an apartment building filled with other residents also using housing vouchers. It's what's called permanent supportive housing, a unit subsidized by the federal government that includes support from a social worker and other services. Residents typically pay 30% of their income in rent, and the voucher takes care of the rest. Since initially Montoya had no job, she paid nothing.
I was super grateful for the opportunity to have a roof over my head so that I could heal. I had case management, I had mental health, I had physical health. I had all of the things all wrapped up into the place that I lived. And then, started entering into society again, the workforce.
It took Montoya a year to even think about applying for jobs. And real estate was off the table because of her criminal record. So she landed in food service.
There's this local Mexican food joint that lets you have your tattoos hanging out and lets you just be who you are. And I was like, well, why don't I just try this? And it was the first time I'd ever really gotten to know the Cuica without any artificial substances in her body. It was just what I needed.
She thrived. And after a few years, she got a job offer to work as a peer mentor with other people struggling with homelessness and mental illness. And she moved into her own place without subsidized rent.
I had no idea I was going to wind up meeting a career path that was, livable or sustainable for me. And so I needed to give that voucher back to somebody else who needed it. And I would say that's when my heart started pounding for the work, wanting to do more, knowing that I had just recovered from an unimaginable crisis in my life and wanting to help others.
She ended up playing a key role in Denver's homeless response during the pandemic. When COVID forced group shelters to shutter, a nonprofit called Colorado Village Collaborative set up a city-sanctioned campsite and hired Montoya.
Actually, I didn't find the job. The job found me. I was personally outreached to help kind of launch this alternative shelter environment for folks experiencing unsheltered homelessness, and that's the Safe Outdoor Space program. And that was when, I would say I started stepping into my own power, and I said, I'm no longer going to live in shame. I'm going to share my journey. I'm going to share it far and wide. Yeah. But ultimately, nobody deserves to be existing outside without access to the things that they need to survive as a human, like bathrooms and showers and trash and things that people need.
Cuica Montoya is now Senior Director of Homelessness Programs for the Colorado Village Collaborative. She's helped operate safe outdoor spaces in 7 Denver neighborhoods at different times. And though the concept was meant to be temporary, the City Council voted in 2023 to make the sanctioned campsites a permanent program. At the same time, Denver's homelessness population again jumped, increasing by 30% in 1 year. Denver's new mayor has vowed to regain traction on the issue and tapped the founding director of Colorado Village Collaborative, Montoya's former boss, to lead the city's homeless initiative. Denver's new mayor also visited the city now considered the nation's leader in tackling homelessness, Houston, Texas, where the homeless population has dropped dramatically.
By over 60% in the past decade alone.
And it was kind of a full circle moment, too, because a decade ago, Houston was visiting Denver for insight. What's Houston's secret? I'm Julie Rose. This is Top of Mind. Before we get back to today's episode, I want to take just a moment to recommend another show from the BYU Radio family of podcasts, The Lisa Show. Life can be stressful, but Lisa Valentine Clark, her guests, and Council of Moms provide a practical yet positive and empowering look at life's challenges. They tackle them head-on, sharing experiences, offering suggestions on how we can handle things like relationships and health, technology, body image, family, and much more. It's The Lisa Show. Listen wherever you get podcasts. Back in 2011, Houston had the 5th highest homeless population in the entire country. The city's mayor assigned Mark Eichenbaum to do something about it.
At the time, we had around 8,500 individuals experiencing homelessness on any given night in the city of Houston. And at the same time, we were named a priority community by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Now, a priority community is not a good designation. It's kind of like getting your hand slapped on the ruler by the teacher. And so they said, look, we're not impressed. We don't like what we're seeing. Homelessness is going up year after year in the greater Houston area, and something needs to change. Now, along with that designation came resources. They wanted to lift us up, help us up, so we could talk to the experts and hire folks to help out. And that's what helped us start this exploration to say, let's change from top down how we respond to homelessness in a very methodical, thoughtful way to get results. And, the mayor at the time said, look, we're spending tens of millions of dollars every single year on this issue, and we're not moving the needle at all. But we were spending millions of dollars on managing the issue of homelessness. We were primarily focused on shelter and food and clothing. We were, spending all this money on helping people survive on the streets instead of focusing on getting people off and out of the streets. And so we needed to have a seismic shift in the way that we responded to homelessness.
What did you decide you had to do differently in Houston?
What we transitioned from being a shelter-based system to being a housing-based system. The person in the shelter is still homeless. You have to get them out of the shelter so they're no longer homeless, and that still takes housing. We used to have more people on our streets than we had in our shelters. The very first year of starting this, we were able to reverse that, and we had more people in our shelters than in our streets. But how did we do that? Did we build more shelter to get the folks on the streets into the shelter? And the answer is no. We didn't create any new shelter. The way we did it is we took the people on the streets, we put them into housing, and that's how we got our street count below our shelter count, and we have never looked back since. So shelters still play a very important role. They are the main front door into our homeless housing system. But shelters are no longer the solution to homelessness. They're an important tool, but they're no longer the solution.
And right from the start, it worked. Houston placed over 11,000 people in permanent housing and effectively ended veteran homelessness in the first 5 years. Since 2011, total homelessness in Houston is down 64%. After shifting away from shelter and toward housing, Mark Eichenbaum says the next crucial step was to get all the city's homeless services agencies coordinating more closely.
And lots of conversations were had with different nonprofit organizations. Hey, you're doing X, Y, and Z, but you're really good at Z. How about you became the main organization that does Z, and we'll get other organizations to do the X, Y. We could find where there was duplicity and where there were voids, and we'd ask some organizations to do stuff different than they had been in the past. We had tons of agencies working on homelessness, but they were all doing their own thing, their own way, with their own goals. There's no method to the madness. Now there's no wrong front door. So whether you're at our mental health diversion facility, our substance abuse diversion center, the day shelters, the night shelters, or if you're on the streets, there's one front door into our housing system. Wherever you might go, our coordinated housing system is there, integrated into that facility. And you do a 20-minute assessment.
So there's one unified housing assessment. Everybody does the same assessment no matter where you enter into the system.
And that's really key. We have one standardized assessment tool that everybody utilizes. We'll have a number of questions, from length of time experiencing to homelessness to medical questions, makeup of their household, to come up with what their vulnerability is. If an individual is considered to be our most vulnerable, you use the term chronically homeless, those are individuals who have been on the streets for an extended period of time and they have a disabling condition. It could be substance abuse, mental health, or even something physical. They do need long-term housing assistance with a high level of support services. But typically for most cities, that's around 25 to 30% of a homeless population. The biggest chunk of the homeless population is what we call the episodically homeless, short-term homeless. They go in and out. They receive anywhere from 6 months to 24 months of housing assistance and case management.
For the chronically homeless individuals, Houston is focused on providing permanent supportive housing. It's the cornerstone of the housing first model that has become the standard approach for many cities, the kind of housing that helped Cuica Montoya transition out of homelessness in Denver.
Now, what's key here is that we will never house an individual without supportive services. It would be negligent to do so. The support services is what keeps the individual housed, and the housing is what makes the services effective. But if a person is focused on where they're going to be sleeping and where they're going to be eating, it's hard for them to fully engage with those services and for those services to be effective. And those service providers are spending most of their time traversing around the city trying to find their clients. And so for services to really be effective, the person needs a safe and stable location first. And so it takes two to tango. Housing needs the services, and the services needs the housing.
So you're not requiring them to be addressing their mental health problems, be taking their medication, be sober, clean from whatever substances. You're not asking them to do all of that before they can get housing.
And the reason is because we used to do that in the past. And that's why we had such high levels of homelessness. What we found, though, is once people are housed, they voluntarily opt into services at a much higher rate, and the services end up being more effective. The reason we're not forcing people and dictating to people to do that is not because we have some bleeding heart. The reason we're making it voluntary is because the data shows that it ends up being much more effective when you do make those services voluntary.
It's more expensive, though, isn't it? I mean, you've basically committed for these individuals that you're going to be, paying for their housing and their services perpetually? Like, maybe their whole lives?
Julie, it sounds expensive, but the reality is it's not. It is more expensive to drive by or walk by these individuals on the streets than it is to put them into housing with wraparound support services. And so your number one cost is going to be to the public health system. And then after that, it's cleaning up the streets, it's cleaning up the parks, it's jail costs, it's shelter costs, it's first responder responses. So at the end of the day, it's fiscally conservative to actually place these individuals in long-term housing with services than to continue having them on the streets. The other reminder here is that this is a set population. 25 to 30%. The vast majority of the population doesn't get long-term housing. It's short-term housing because it's tailored to their exact needs.
Okay, so what is it that you're doing differently then to meet those needs in order to solve your homelessness problem? These other people that are more in episodic or kind of like on the edge because of affordability and job stability and maybe some health problems, what are you doing differently for that population?
What we're doing different is that we are putting them in a unit, and they're signing their lease to that unit. So even when they're done with our program, unlike in the past where they would be back on the streets. That is their unit to stay in. They're just now paying for it, and we're not. So, nationally, this type of housing intervention is called rapid rehousing.
Okay.
And it's that short-term housing with a lease attached to it. And they have a case manager who's working with them. Now, we don't just stop the assistance cold turkey. That as the government assistance starts to wean, then their responsibility starts to increase. Folks all the time will say, I see the homeless on the streets. If you put them in housing, they're not going to stay housed. But the reality is, when you provide support services with it, folks do stay housed. Recidivism rates are really low. And so we're finding out for us, that program, we're about 85% of those individuals in our rapid rehousing program are staying housed 2 years or longer. In our permanent supportive housing program for the most vulnerable, we're at around, closer to 95% of those individuals are staying housed 2 years or longer. That's huge.
So where did you all of a sudden magically find places to house these individuals? Did Houston just have a glut of affordable housing kind of sitting around, empty apartments?
No, Houston does not have enough affordable housing. I don't know any major city that has enough affordable housing. And so what we've done is the city and county has jointly funded a apartment liaison team. And this team goes out and calls and knocks on doors and tries to find any and all landlords that will participate. The mayor will have meeting with the landlords. Our chief economic development officer is opening up his Rolodex to landlords. But the team needs tools to be successful. And one of those tools is an incentive to offer. Landlord, if you're willing to lease to our client, not the person standing behind us that may have cash in hand and may not have a challenging background, but if you're willing to lease to our client, we will give you a $1,600 incentive. Now, there are some jurisdictions in California that offer a $5,500 incentive because the incentive is based on whatever amount it will take to buy into the market and move that local market. Now, $5,500 may seem like a ton, but it's cheaper than building brand new and spending 4 years trying to build brand new. And it's less expensive than having those folks on the street.
And where is this money coming from for you guys then in Houston?
Well, that's a good question because Houston is the only major city in the country not to put local government dollars into homelessness. And so the city operates underneath a voter-imposed revenue cap. And so the city really does not have any general fund money to go into homelessness. And so that's one reason why we had to be different. Too often, cities will put a little bit of the federal money into everybody's bucket to make everybody happy, but they're spreading the resources so thin, they're not able to achieve impact. We need to squeeze all the juice we can out of that orange. Even in just homelessness, there's so many different sub-buckets. There's veterans, and there's youth, there's aging out of foster care, and there's domestic violence, and there's women. So not only does federal funds need to be targeted to the issue of homelessness, but even within the issue of homelessness, you target it down to specific subpopulations so that you can really get that impact. Now, once you get the impact in that bucket, then it frees up resources to go to the next bucket and go to the next one after that.
So you do still have to respect, in some cases, there is money specifically for veteran homelessness from the federal government. And in that case, then, the advantage of all this collaboration is that you can make sure that if you have any veterans out there who are homeless, you're using that money and not the money that could be going to, a rapid rehousing effort or somebody who's not a veteran. Right.
You're exactly right. Exactly right. It's like a game of checkers of what funds fund what, because some might be more flexible, some might be more restrictive, and it's a jigsaw puzzle at the end of the day.
Houston was humming right along, steadily chipping away at the numbers until 2017, when Hurricane Harvey hit and the trend line reversed. Homelessness went up 15% that year.
Things were not looking good for Houston. And then, as perverse as it sounds, the gift of COVID happened. And with COVID came vital federal resources that helped us amplify our efforts and house a lot more individuals. And that's what helped us get a major decrease in homelessness of 25% in the past 3 years.
While most cities have seen
has
the
seen
opposite.
increases.
Yeah.
But this is the thing. That engine was already built. What that engine needed was the gas, the resources to make it run. And COVID brought those resources. Now, though, those COVID dollars have been used up. And so right now, this is a challenge for our city. How do we keep momentum going when we have no sustainable funding sources to respond to homelessness?
How do you not become a Denver in the long run? You know, like Houston, 10 years from now, people are like, yeah, well, Houston was great and they really had it going, but too bad they lost that. You know, what is the secret to maintaining that momentum long term?
What folks don't realize is that it takes a lot of money and effort just to sustain a city's level of homelessness. It takes even more effort and more resources to actually get reductions in homelessness. So Denver's doing really big stuff right now, and they're doing an amazing job. But Denver, after being a poster child, experienced an increase in homelessness. And this is why you have to keep your foot on the pedal. So there is no mission accomplished moment when it comes to working on homelessness. Once you're pressing the pedal, you have to keep your foot on the accelerator, because the minute you take it off, regression will happen.
Forever, ever. There's never a point at which people are no longer falling into homelessness in your community because you've set things up effectively.
According to Kinder Institute at Rice University, nearly 40% of Houstonians do not have $400 and cannot get it from their friends and family. It's not in a bank account. It's not under a mattress. And so 40% of Houstonians are one missed paycheck, one broken down car, one medical emergency from falling into homelessness. And you compound that with the affordable housing issues that every city is dealing with in the country. We're focused on just getting people off the streets. We're not focused on solving poverty in general. People will continue to fall into homelessness every single day. The key here is that you have to house more people out of homelessness in a given month than will fall into homelessness that month to start getting net reductions. So look, we're not resting on our laurels. We are not happy where homelessness is right now. So we are saying, what's that next step we need to do? In Houston, we have some gall here. We built a port 50 miles inland. We put a man on the moon. We did the first dome stadium. We go big, or you just don't do it. And so, we're going big on homelessness to try to get people home.
Mark Eichenbaum is a special assistant to the mayor of Houston. He heads up homeless initiatives there in Houston. Thank you for your time today, Mark. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Julie.
Now, a housing-focused approach to ending homelessness obviously requires housing. And it's clear one of the biggest drivers of homelessness in the United States right now is high rent. There just aren't enough affordable options for people who need them. So cities, keen to end homelessness, spend a lot of time drumming up rent subsidies and battling neighbors opposed to new affordable housing. But they're ignoring a powerful tool at their disposal.
Building new units where it's like $1 million condos is actually helping to reduce the price of housing overall in your city.
Just embracing the law of supply and demand can help cities solve homelessness. That's next on Top of Mind. And then we'll hear about a tiny house alternative in Silicon Valley that's got the nation taking note. I'm Julie Rose. We'll be right back. Hey, friends, if you are looking for another great show from the BYU Radio family of podcasts, check out Constant Wonder. Host Marcus Smith takes you on an exhilarating journey through captivating stories of our magnificent natural world. You'll gain profound insight into different facets of our planet, discover more about nature, and maybe even ponder your connection to Earth's wonder. The show is Constant Wonder, and you can find it wherever you get your podcasts. One of Catherine Einstein's main research projects is a survey of mayors.
We have actually been running a survey of mayors at Boston University out of the Initiative on Cities for about 10 years.
Einstein is a professor of political science at Boston University. Recently, she noticed a disconnect in how cities are tackling homelessness.
We asked an open-ended question of mayors, sort of, what do you think is the biggest driver of homelessness in your city? And only 48% of them cited things related to housing.
When pressed, they might talk about trying to get more affordable housing, but not more housing in general.
There's lots of economics research which suggests in the aggregate that if we build more housing, we reduce prices, that housing, like many other markets, follows the laws of supply and demand. There is, however, both within the general public and among public officials, a strand of what some researchers call supply skepticism, where essentially they don't believe that building new units where it's like $1 million condos is actually helping to reduce the price of housing overall in your city.
But when we talk about reducing, addressing homelessness as a problem, I mean, what you really need are very, very affordable housing and the very low end. And then you need sort of within reach of people who are right on the line type of housing for lots of other people. And isn't that the piece that is missing? Like lots of cities are seeing $1 million condos going in, but that's not doing enough to kind of make even the lowest end within reach to the people most at risk of homelessness or, in fact, homeless.
Yeah, so it's absolutely fair, right, to say that just having more market rate housing alone is not going to create ultra affordable housing that is accessible to people who've recently experienced homelessness. But when we build more housing like that, and at other price points, right, not to just fixate on $1 million condos, but when we build housing at a variety of price points, what we do is we reduce pressure on those lower cost housing units that might end up getting turned over or flipped when we are in conditions of scarcity. So again, if I'm thinking about what a city looks like with a healthy housing market where we are preventing people from experiencing homelessness in the first place, those higher end units are part of the story.
So if many, many mayors have not fully grasped the value of housing, new housing, as a tool in their tool belt to deal with homelessness, what is the action that they could take?
Yeah, right. So there's tons of different things you can do. A lot of researchers think that control over land use and zoning is actually the most powerful policy tool that local officials wield. You can streamline permitting processes to make it easier to build all types of housing, everything from single room occupancy to, multifamily housing with larger units, right? There's lots of different housing out there that can help to address this crisis. And local governments, they don't have the money to subsidize lots of construction, right? We don't at the local level have the money to start building, tons of publicly owned housing. That's something the federal government could do. But if a mayor wanted to say turn around housing in their city tomorrow, they can make it easier to build by reforming their land use and zoning.
If they can get their voters and citizens on board with that. Which is the big if and but, right?
Yeah. It's why don't they do this? So we know that a strong majority of people do not like when things are built next to them. We see this in public opinion data. We see it when we look at sort of who are the people who show up to public meetings. This is sort of part of general human nature, at least in American cities, that people fight housing that's built next to them.
For good reason. I mean, there's noise, there's mess, there's traffic. It's not fun to have a giant construction project or even just a new home being built in your backyard or right next door.
Totally, right? So this is housing has these concentrated costs and diffuse benefits. If I live right next door to a new development, which I do right now, hopefully no one's hearing the construction noise that's happening next door to me, it's unpleasant, right? There's all sorts of reasons that you might not like something being built next to you. In contrast, new housing has these incredibly diffuse benefits. A 3-unit building being built next to me, right? That has all sorts of annoying things for me as a neighbor. But that contribution to the housing supply is pretty marginal. And so that's not really going to motivate housing supporters in the same way. But changing permitting and zoning processes, that actually does have the possibility of motivating pro-housing organizers. And we've seen in a lot of cities across the country that are facing housing crises, cities and states actually sort of voluntarily take on zoning reform in large part because of these organizing efforts and folks who sort of recognize that it's not so great living next door to a construction project, but it's even less pleasant to live in a metro area that is slowly strangling itself by not building enough housing to meet demand, which makes it a lot easier for public officials to pass these policies when you have organizers sort of saying yeah, we support this and we're going to show up to meetings to endorse these policies.
There are zoning reforms that Einstein says are less likely to face pushback.
I think things like accessory dwelling units have tended to be, even if people sort of get worked up in the moment that these policies are getting debated, once they're passed, we haven't seen a whole lot of contestation of those policies. So an accessory dwelling unit policy essentially allows you to maybe build an in-law suite or just sort of some kind of additional unit on an existing plot of land. And the theory is that this contributes to sort of gentle densification of an area rather than radical changes. I think one caution for that kind of policy is we're not going to solve our housing crisis in many communities just by adding in gentle density. If we've been underbuilding for decades, as we have in places like Massachusetts and California, just adding in in-law suites isn't going to sort of be at the scale that we need to address this crisis. But I do think we can find ways to sort of say, hey, let's add duplexes or triplexes, right? We don't necessarily have to sort of get people worked up about the boogeyman of some massive building coming into their single family neighborhood and transforming what they perceive as their beloved space.
Changes that go beyond gentle density might need some help from higher up. Einstein says state-level policies can provide cover for local leaders worried about political backlash.
It really helps if you're a public official who wants to engage in zoning reform. You can sort of say like, hey guys, I get that you're frustrated residents who are not excited about new housing, but the state government has tied our hands. And if we want to keep getting, funding for our public housing or funding for transportation or whatever, we need to follow state law. So we've actually seen state governments say to the local governments, hey, you guys aren't doing enough to solve this horrible housing crisis. So we are going to require you to change your zoning to allow for the development of more housing. And if you don't do that, we are going to say that you are violating state law, and maybe we're going to withhold grant programs, or we're going to do other kinds of things to incentivize you to change your zoning to actually allow more housing to be built.
Is there a community that you see doing this well right now? Any success story you could describe for us? Or even like moving in the direction that seems like they've got it figured out?
In Massachusetts, they passed a policy in 2021 called MBTA communities. So the mass transit system here is the MBTA. And what this piece of legislation said is if you are served by mass transit, if you're one of these suburban communities that has not been building anywhere near enough housing and you are served by mass transportation, you need to increase your allowable density to create transit-oriented development and to create new housing opportunities that are walkable and climate friendly. And so over the last year in 2023, the first set of communities that were affected by this policy had to reform their zoning to comply with state law.
Or what? What's the punishment if they don't?
So we're going to find that out because one town did not do. Oh. They just had a referendum where they actually, their legislative body had approved a zoning change. And then there was a townwide referendum to overturn the approved change. It was the town of Milton.
The citizens said, no, thank you. Okay, interesting.
A very small group of citizens who turned out to vote in an off-cycle election said, no, thank you. And so now the Secretary of State, Andrea Campbell in Massachusetts, is sort of coming up with the plan of what is going to happen to communities that are non-compliant. We know they'll lose access to some forms of grant funding, but it's not clear yet what other sort of sticks the state might wield to get places to comply.
And if a state and a city were to use all the levers that you've described in the way that you've described, how quickly would change would they actually start to have enough housing to deal with the shortage?
This is a policy that takes so long to have a real impact because zoning isn't the only thing that affects construction times. I mean, anyone who's done a kitchen renovation can tell you these projects never go on time. There's all sorts of unexpected delays and unexpected things that happen. And so when you take that from just a minor home renovation and think about building a large multi-unit building, these things take years. And so reforming zoning, I wouldn't expect to see sort of really measurable changes from that for 5 to 10 years, which again makes it really hard if you're running as a mayor saying look what I've done for affordability. And it's you haven't done anything yet. It's 10 years from now, you might do something, but there won't be something measurable for your next election.
Catherine Levine Einstein is a professor of political science. She studies housing, affordability, zoning, city decisions regarding homelessness, and she's a professor at Boston University. Thank you so much for your time today, Professor.
Thank you so much for having me.
No state has it worse than California when it comes to high housing prices and a shortage of housing in general. Not coincidentally, California also has the highest rate of homeless people living on the street. But taking a housing-centric approach to the problem is a tall order.
We're spending all of our resources to build permanent supportive housing.
This is philanthropist Elizabeth Funk.
The problem with that, of course, is that it's costing over $650,000 per unit to build on an average across California. And in our big cities, it's $1 million. And we can't build it that quickly. And for every one person who is getting that permanent supportive housing, 3 or 4 are falling into homelessness. So if that's our only solution, those numbers don't work.
Funk is the founder and CEO of a nonprofit called Dignity Moves, which has gained national attention for building temporary, tiny house communities in California, often without government funding or even city approval. It's a quintessentially Silicon Valley approach.
I was on the founding team of Microsoft Office, then went to business school, and this little company called Yahoo had about 5 employees and no sign on the door. And my mother was horrified that I was taking a job at a company with an exclamation point at the end of its name. I was really steeped in the entrepreneurial ethos of Silicon Valley, of trying things and see what worked. So that's really carried with me to this day. And when I left Yahoo, I got very involved with impact investing and particularly global poverty, microfinance. And my mom, who is very patriotic, kept nagging me, saying, "Why are you helping the poor everywhere else? What about in America?"
Just as she began looking for an issue closer to home, the pandemic happened. A conference she was scheduled to attend about homelessness got canceled.
And somebody had the great idea, why don't we just form a virtual task force and see what we can learn about this together? And as we started to dive into it, I had an aha moment that just was, wow, we've really been thinking about this wrong. I'll never forget the night when I was sitting on the sofa thinking, oh man, I'm gonna have to do this. It's just so obvious to me that there's a missing vision. And out of that came Dignity Moves.
Can you tell me a little more about that aha moment? What it was that had you thinking we've been dealing with homelessness wrong?
When people first become homeless, the vast majority do not yet have a debilitating mental or behavioral health problem that would prevent them from returning to self-sufficiency. 80% or more could get back on their feet the day they became homeless. 4 weeks later, the percent has cut in half, and the average wait time for permanent housing or any housing in places like San Francisco is 14 years. So when you get somebody on the street, 14 years later, they are all mentally ill and drug addicted, of course. It wouldn't take me 4 weeks to have that trauma. 14 years later, or even 6 months later, there's a very slim chance. And so we're allowing this problem to become intractable. Why are we not focusing on interim solutions, on something that can be done quicker? Well, the metrics are wrong. And when you look at it, when someone moves from unsheltered homelessness into sheltered homelessness, they're still homeless. The city's homeless count hasn't changed.
So what makes them not homeless?
So when somebody gets into permanent housing, they're funded by the federal government through a Section 8 housing choice voucher. They are considered no longer homeless. When they move from the streets into a shelter, they get categorized as sheltered homeless, but they are still homeless. And so cities, quite frankly, have a perverse incentive to leave people on the streets until they get into permanent housing where they're therefore covered by the federal government. To me, a city's metric ought to be the number of nights per year of sleeping on the streets. And that metric, we could absolutely have the goal that it is 0. We should have safe places for everyone.
This is where her entrepreneurial thinking kicks in.
Okay, what are the hurdles? Why aren't we building interim housing? Well, land is really expensive. Okay, great. Let's make them relocatable. Let's borrow land. Building codes are onerous. Okay, well, this is an emergency. Cities have declared emergencies. We can use emergency building codes. And people don't like group shelters. Great, let's make sure everybody's got their own room with a door that locks. Oh, but the NIMBYs are so opposed. Great, let's only offer placement to the people sleeping in the immediate area so that that neighborhood gets the visible and measurable difference. Bring me another hurdle and let's think through it logically. And so we started thinking about, okay, relocatable cabins. The good news is there are tons of manufacturers for backyard accessory dwelling units. You can buy them at Walmart, you can buy them on Amazon. That was the genesis of Dignity Moves.
In mid-2021, she started working on the first Dignity Moves site. The plan was to build it in San Francisco, where Funk lives, but the city wasn't pleased.
I started calling the Department of Homelessness. They would not accept a meeting with me. I tried and finally had to call my council supervisor and said, could you please get me a meeting with the Department of Homelessness? And the conversation started off with, any money we spend on anything that isn't permanent is a waste of resources. I said, well, good news, it's going to be fully philanthropic. They said, anytime my staff spends talking to you about something that isn't permanent is a waste of resources. I said, well, then don't talk to us. Just let us build this pilot. We built it fully philanthropically. The city let us use a site that was already a sanctioned tent encampment, so safe sleeping. So the city already had a contract with a security company to bring meals and watch over the tents. So they allowed us to upgrade the safe sleeping. So it's a total of 70 rooms, about the size of a college dorm room, just big enough for a bed, a desk, a chair, a heater, and a door that locks. The development budget was a little over $2 million, so about $32,000 per unit. That's all in with computer lab and offices and landscaping and all the rest. And then there are shared bathroom and dining facilities. Again, kind of like college. In college, you don't have your own bathroom and kitchen, and that is by design. That's a feature, not a bug. They want you to come out and share community. And at this stage in someone's homeless cycle, it's really healthy. And quite frankly, it's a sorting mechanism. You get people in and let them have a few nights of great sleep, and then we can start figuring out who can reunite with family, who needs a bus ticket to another place where they can get a job, who needs psychiatric care, who needs, medical care.
Who's doing that stuff?
So we partner with local organizations that know how to do that. It's a different organization in each city. The person gets assigned a case manager who is basically like a parent who sits with you a couple times a week and says, all right, what are their hurdles?
Do they have to be sober?
No.
Okay. Can they use drugs in the community?
So in California and really most of the country, there's a concept called housing first, which is that you shouldn't be expecting someone to commit to sobriety or other things until they have housing, because it's just really hard to get sober when you're on the streets. Best practice that I've seen is that while they don't require you to be sober, you do sign a participation agreement when you come that says you won't be violent, you won't have guns. And one of the things is you will say, I will not engage in behavior that is disruptive to a healthy and healing environment for my peers. And then you declare that using drugs openly is not conducive to a healthy environment. And so each of our services agencies have slightly different ways they implement that. But they do a pretty good job of dissuading it and hopefully getting people into treatment.
And how long can people stay?
Typical stay is 6 months to 2 years. Some funding sources only allow 90 days, some allow 1 year. But I'm adamant that once you've gotten someone indoors and stable, there's no way we're releasing you back out on the street.
Can these units qualify for housing choice? If someone could stay there and they're getting the supportive services, would you like to see this considered housing and eligible for federal funds?
You have hit a very hot button for me, my dear. Why couldn't that subsidy start sooner in the person's episode of homelessness? I am not going to try to say that this is a permanent solution for that person. But could they get their housing choice voucher and start applying it and stay another 6 months? Absolutely. I think that they could and should.
But is there the risk that building more of this kind of housing because it's more feasible in a place like San Francisco, that the permanent piece actually doesn't get solved?
Great question. And we get hit with that very often. And there is a very real concern that if we have our utopia and get everybody in off the streets and there's no feces and needles, the pressure will be off the city and they won't build the permanent housing that they need. First of all, that would be a good problem to have. I'm not interested in leaving people on the streets as political bargaining chips. But let's think about it this way. If you witnessed a car crash, you would rush up to the person who's bleeding. You'd wrap it with a dirty towel. It will not be perfect. You don't stop and ask whether this part of the road is zoned for medical treatment. You do emergency intervention. Then that person can get in the hospital and get the surgery that they need, which does solve their life. This is emergency housing. It is not intended to be perfect, but you've got to stop that bleeding, because if you left them languishing, their wounds will get worse and worse, to which point they may not ever recover. If we get everybody indoors, we've got 14 years of backlog. I hate talking about it as inventory, but it's my business mind. Then the permanent housing starts to come online and people start getting through. And the people who are in interim housing, more and more, a higher percent of them will be newly homeless and not yet chronic. And those folks are going to have a higher probability of self-resolving, of getting a job and so forth, the people who are newly homeless. So you're starting to talk about a system that's in balance that basically doesn't need much interim housing as the permanent housing starts to develop. And keep in mind, our goal is to decrease demand for permanent supportive housing and increase demand for permanent affordable housing. There's never going to be a shortage of developers interested in building affordable housing. That supply will come. And we put ourselves out of business, which is definitely the goal.
That first Dignity Move site is still standing in San Francisco. There have been 7 more since, and other cities are lining up to get their own.
In downtown Santa Barbara, we built a Dignity Moves site community for 34 units that is on a site that was owned by the county that's ultimately going to be developed into permanent housing. We are literally next door to Morgan Stanley's private client services. How do you think that went over? But the first person who got invited was the person sleeping in Morgan Stanley's parking lot. The clients had to walk over in order to get to their wealth advisor. And the next 2 was a couple who were in the alley next to Morgan Stanley. You start thinking about it that way, and all of a sudden Morgan Stanley's pretty pleased. You can have those same people on that parking lot in tents, hungry, disgruntled, haven't slept, off their meds, and quite frankly, pretty pissed off. Or you could have those same people on that same site, behind a beautiful gate, 24/7 staffing, security. You don't have visitors. You're not allowed to linger around. Which would you like? Because there is not a third choice. Everyone loved it so much. One of the supervisors took me to breakfast and said, we should do one in North County. And on a moment's whim, I said, no. We're not going to chip away at this 30 rooms at a time. Let's do the whole county, enough beds for everybody who needs it, quite frankly, so that you can hold people accountable and not have anyone sleeping on the streets in Santa Barbara County. So we're doing that. All of the supervisors went into a closed session and had to each pick one site in their district. Nobody gets the political slam, nobody gets the points. They all picked a site in their district, and we are opening 2 more this month. And $19 million of private capital, and we can end the problem.
So what is your response when people say, I'm so glad you're so enthused by this, but homelessness is just unsolvable? Like even cities that are having great success are also having problems with encampments. You're just not going to be able to solve it. What is your answer to them?
Oh my gosh, I have to tell you, that is a great question, because it's really what this organization is about. I believe that the biggest thing holding us back is that people just believe it's not possible. And that disillusionment and that cynicism is the single biggest challenge we have. Showing people that it is possible will get us there. And when I say that, I want to be clear that getting people indoors does not solve homelessness. They're still sheltered homeless. The only thing that ends homelessness is having enough permanent housing for people. But unsheltered homelessness is the most visible, the most inhumane, and the only part of that problem that is actually solvable. Mental health and job losses and economic, all that stuff is the hard part. 4 walls and a roof, gotta tell me that's not possible. In this day and age, we've sent men to the moon, we've decoded the human genome. If we can't get 4 walls around somebody, we're standing in our own way.
Elizabeth Funk is founder and CEO of Dignity Moves. It's been great having you with us today for Top of Mind. Thanks for tuning in. If there's somebody you know who would find this episode helpful or thought-provoking, please share it with them. Word of mouth is the #1 way people discover new podcasts. We'd love your help with that. Top of Mind is a BYU radio podcast. Today's episode was produced by Amber Mortensen and James Hoops, with help from Samuel Benson, Sam Payne, and me. Our audio engineer and sound design team includes Brendan Lewis, Kelsey Ney, and Trent Reimschissel. I'm Julie Rose. We'll talk soon.